For the past 60 years, Texas has led the nation in economic growth and job creation, and it regularly lists in the top fastest growing states in the country. But that prosperity has not touched all corners of the state. This is Port Arthur in far southeast Texas along the Louisiana border, and it's a shell of the prosperous city it once was. And while the population of Texas has tripled since 1960, Port Arthur has been shrinking. It's home to the US's largest refining complex, and the city boomed and ultimately busted with changing industry on a very similar timeline to the decline of the American Rust Belt. So what went wrong? Why here? And what's on the horizon for a place like Port Arthur? Let's find out. Walking through the streets of downtown Port Arthur is an eye-opening experience. A far cry from the booming skylines of Austin or Dallas, the streets here are lined with boarded-up storefronts, broken windows, and vacant lots. In fact, outside of the city government complex, nearly the entire downtown of Port Arthur is abandoned. But to understand why Port Arthur looks like this today, we have to go 127 years back to the city's origin story. Port Arthur is located here on Sabine Lake, just before the river flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Sabine Lake is a natural saltwater inlet protected from the open water, and there were several ultimately failed attempts at settling the area both for homesteading and industrial uses during the early and mid-1800s. Port Arthur as we know it dates back to 1895 when Arthur Stillwell, founder of the Kansas City, Pittsburgh and Gulf Railroad, developed this land as the southern end of his rail network. He incorporated the town in 1898, named after himself. Stillwell developed Port Arthur as the missing link connecting ocean vessels to his inland rail network, and the town's port received its first ship the following year. Almost 1,000 people had settled in Port Arthur by 1900. But things in Port Arthur were about to go off the charts. Spindletop was located just 15 miles northwest of downtown Port Arthur, and when oil was struck here, the course of history for southeast Texas changed forever. Both local landowners and out-of-town prospectors made immense fortunes here, but Port Arthur established its place on the refining end of the Texas boom. The port and railroad were quickly joined by pipelines connecting Stillwell's empire to the rest of the country, built by the largest oil companies of the day. The first refinery opened in 1902, and by 1916, it was the largest refining site in the U.S. Port Arthur's population grew by 700% between 1900 and 1910, and over 100% in the 2 decades following. Post-World War II Port Arthur, then an established petro city that had been instrumental during the war, drew thousands to work in the refining industry and supporting services. But there was a problem. Port Arthur's vast fortune was built on one industry, and that industry was changing. Port Arthur lived and breathed on refinery jobs. Whether or not people worked in the refineries directly, this money was fueled into the whole city. The prosperous oil boom began to taper in the 60s, and the OPEC embargo in the 70s put the industry in a tailspin and eliminated many employment opportunities, especially those readily available to low-skilled residents. This also coincided with the trend of suburbanization that was occurring in many U.S. cities during the same time period, and thousands left Port Arthur for neighboring suburbs Nederland and Groves. Port Arthur's downtown was birthed as a product of the early 1900s oil boom, and it was a testament to the city's prosperity and opportunity. It also catered strongly to business. The tallest buildings here were hotels, followed by banks and office buildings, and this post office that's almost offensively grand given the city's current state. And that's a recurring theme in the story of Port Arthur. The decaying buildings are opulent, indicating a luxury that defined the boom days, and now sit as a reminder of how much things have changed here. The once tallest building here, the 1929 Goodhue Hotel, was demolished in 1990, and the site sits empty today. This was a T.B. Baker Hotel, the most famous of which is the Baker Hotel in Mineral Wells. Now, the 1929 Sabine Hotel is the tallest building in the city, but it too has been abandoned for a long time. In 2015, there was a push by a city council member to have the building demolished. That attempt failed, and today its shell still looms over the vacant streets of downtown. There's also the old World Trade Center, a reminder of the important things that once went on here. Around the main commercial streets, the blocks of shorter buildings that once formed an entire walkable downtown are now mostly abandoned or demolished. There are entire blocks of downtown Port Arthur where every single building has been torn down. There have been multiple pushes over the years to restore downtown's former glory. Most recently, the city put out a 2015 revitalization plan that includes the restoration of city buildings, federally assisted housing development, and financial incentives for private developers. The recurring issue in the redevelopment attempts in Port Arthur is that the purpose the buildings were built to serve doesn't exist here anymore. And Port Arthur faces practical problems in the 21st century. There are things that are not ideal about living here. Like much of the Gulf Coast, it's humid, low-lying, and flood-prone. The official elevation of the city is just 7 feet above sea level, with many areas lower, and nearly everything lower than the top of the dike that protects the city from the Sabine River. The refineries that built Port Arthur's prosperity still operate today, dwarfing the rest of the city and emitting pollution, noise, and smells, but also still serving as the primary economic engine of the entire region. But while refining production here is higher than ever, the number of people required has been in decline for a long time, down 30% nationwide since 1990. The poverty rate today in Port Arthur is over twice the state average. Port Arthur declined in similar ways and for similar reasons as the American Rust Belt. It also followed a very similar timeline. But the population drop of Port Arthur is not nearly as marked as those of the most decimated Rust Belt cities. The city's population peaked at around 66,000 people in 1960 and today sits at 56,000, a 15% drop. By contrast, Detroit has lost over half of its 1960 population. Beyond the central business district in Port Arthur, the scene is not nearly as apocalyptic. Residential neighborhoods, especially on the historically wealthier east side of town, make it easy to forget about the decaying city center just a few miles away. Although some of Port Arthur's population drop was picked up by neighboring suburbs, the economic and population decline felt here lingers in some capacity or another over the entire region. Like the rest of the Gulf Coast, Port Arthur's been at the constant threat of Gulf storms. In fact, a hurricane drove out an entire settlement here predating Arthur Stillwell. Hurricane Harvey put much of the city underwater in 2017, and like hurricanes before it, it pushed some residents to leave the city for good. Now, amidst all of this, I'm excited to report some perhaps unexpected good news. Motiva, the owner of Port Arthur's largest refinery, announced plans in 2016 to locate their new corporate campus in the abandoned buildings of downtown. In 2019, they began renovation of the post office and World Trade Building. After taking a hiatus in 2020, construction resumed again in 2021. On the day I visited, there was evidence of progress and work on both buildings. Motiva owns all 4 buildings at this intersection, and this is by far the most important development made in downtown Port Arthur in a long time. Modern-day Port Arthur is a fascinating place. It's a city built on the opulence of a very specific boom that slowly went bust, where the biggest testaments to the city's once great prosperity stand hollowed out, fighting an often losing battle against time and humidity. It's also by and large still a functioning city where 56,000 people go about life, some with ambitious plans about the future of what Port Arthur could be. But the days that warranted places like the Goodhue Hotel seem long gone. Scott Daly here. If you like this video, share it with someone you think would find it interesting. If you're from Port Arthur, comment below about your experience living there. As always, thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and come with me on the next adventure.